Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Europa Rediviva. Romania is about to appoint as prime minister somebody who has all three citizenships of the Odessa Triangle, where Romania is integrated together with Moldova and Ukraine. He was born in the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, was raised in independent Ukraine, and became a naturalized Romanian citizen when he came to study at the university. And he subsequently took on also the citizenship of the Republic of Moldova through his marriage. Therefore, Romania will have a prime minister which holds the citizenship of its neighbor. In my opinion, this is also part of this continuous effort to subordinate Romanian interests to the Ukrainian ones. And this comes from the delusion of the Romanian elites, who believe that they have to look for an external master to serve. This is an instinct that they've always had. It's something transgenerational. It goes from century to century. The external paymaster changed, but the nature of the Romanian elites stayed the same. And I was arguing in a previous video that this is different from Romania's neighbors. If we compare Romania's elites to the Bulgarian ones and to the Serbian ones, we can definitely notice that the process of elite formation is different historically. So the Bulgarian and Serbian elites were formed after these countries gained statehood, after they stopped being provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman system, the landed aristocracy was Turkish, was Ottoman, and it subsequently had to leave the country when those two statal entities were formed. And, at least when they became independent. But I think the Ottoman aristocracy had to leave already at statehood. So that would be in the 1830s for the Serbs, and in 1878 for the Bulgarians. Romania had its own landed gentry, which was inherited century by century. There were these aristocrats. Some families were from Constantinople. They came during the Phanariot period, but some others were older. But there was a clear distinction in the Middle Ages when the Romanian principalities appeared in history between the landed aristocracy, the boyars, and the peasants, the indentured peasants, the serfs. And interestingly enough, the landed aristocracy used, at least from the 14th century, when the two polities became attested, Moldova and Wallachia, all the way to the beginning of the 18th century, used medieval Bulgarian as a written language. Probably the vernacular was Romanian, but the vernacular of the peasants and of the aristocracy, we have no information. So we can assume that to some extent they also spoke Bulgarian, because some evolution of the so-called Slavonic language can be attested in the north of the Danube, in these Wallachian and Moldovan principality, throughout the 4 centuries of existence of this language. So it's not just that a dead language was taken on and used as a language of culture and as a language of liturgy, but this language suffered all sorts of transformations, which make some linguists, some Slavists, to assume that the language was also used colloquially, which makes some historians to believe that the aristocracy, at least in the early centuries of the two Romanian principalities, Moldova and Wallachia, were Bulgarian speakers. It's not just the use of the Bulgarian language, but also the fact that the two polities, the territory of the two polities, had been part of the Bulgarian empires, the Bulgarian kingdoms. The Bulgarian Tsarstvo, both the first and the second, stretched on both banks of the Danube. A large Vlah aristocracy is recorded, at least in the case of the second Bulgarian Empire, which also started as an uprising where the Vlachs took a prominent role. So the fact that the Vlachs in the Bulgarian Empire on both sides of the Danube used Bulgarian as a written language, because this was also the first written language of the Slavs, the first liturgical language of the Orthodox people that was not Greek. This makes quite a lot of sense. And there's also one more indication that perhaps the early aristocracy of the Romanian principalities was Bulgarian. The fact that, of course, all the aristocratic ranks were taken from Slavonic, so boyar, knyaz, all of these, voivode. And also the statute of the indentured agricultural laborers, so the peasants, but the indentured peasants, the serfs. The condition of the serfs was called Românie, so it was called essentially Romanianness. Român was another term for serf. So, okay, we could be in the situation of some parallel situation to that of Western countries, Western kingdoms of the time, of medieval Europe, where the aristocracy speaks one language and the peasantry speaks another, for example, in England. This is why we have this parallelism between the French words for beef, mutton, poultry, veal, and pork, and the animal equivalent, which are in Anglo-Saxon, so pig, cow, chicken, and so on, because it was the English peasant that reared these animals, and it was the, well, Normand aristocracy, French-speaking Normand aristocrats, who ate them. And this is why the meat is called in French and the animal in English. So it might have something to do with this, just like the aristocracy in Western continental Europe was Gothic, the descendants of the Goths and the Franks and all sorts of German tribes. It could well be that the aristocracy of the early centuries of the Romanian principalities was Bulgarian. And then there were a lot of influxes. There were some Albanian families. I think Ghica was the most prominent Albanian one. There were a lot of Greek Constantinopolitan families coming after the fall of Constantinople. There was subsequently this huge Greek influx of aristocrats from the time when the Sultan appointed Greeks from Fanar, from the Fanar neighborhood of Constantinople, to head the Romanian principalities as princes. But at least until around 1715, the language of the aristocracy, of the landed boyars, was Bulgarian, at least the written language. It was Slavonic, as it is called in Romanian historiography, Middle Bulgarian essentially. And after the Greek influx of aristocrats from Fanar, the language started to be Romanian, because Greek was not known, at least for the Bulgarian there had been a tradition, but for Greek it was not not known among the population, so therefore the idea to make the official language Greek was dropped, and the vernacular started to be used. Even though Greek started to be the academic language, 2 schools were started during this time, one in Iași, one in Bucharest, and both of them taught in Greek until the first half of the 19th century. And of course the locus of prestige was Constantinople. In earlier times, before Moldova and Wallachia were subjects of the Ottoman Empire, the locus of prestige had been the suzerain power. In the first century of their existence, in the 14th century, that was Hungary. the um, the princely family from Wallachia married into the Hungarian aristocracy. Both Wallachia and Moldova started out as marches, defense marches against the Tartars, built by the Kingdom of Hungary, and both had as capitals some Saxon outposts. Cumpulung, for the case of Wallachia, Longo Campo, as it was known then, and Baia Civitas Baiensis. Both of them were outposts of the Saxons. Baia was of the Bistrița Saxons, and Cumpulung of the Sibiu Saxons. And the elites had a very different life than that of the peasants. Of course, it's obvious because it's a medieval system. It's feudalism. The agricultural population was obviously Romanian. There were some slaves as well, and the slaves were mostly not Romanian. They were either Roma or they were Tartars. So there was an ethnical component in this as well. But being Romanian, essentially, for the first 5 centuries, I would say, of the existence of the Romanian principalities, was more or less equated to being a peasant. And the political history of these countries, is more or less the history of the aristocracy. And the center of prestige, as I said, moved started being Constantinople. In the case of Moldova, it was for a brief period of time Poland, because Poland around the 1500s was strong enough to make Moldova a vassal, but it did not last long. And there was some collaboration. This is why, for example, the Academy of Kiev, which was initially a theological academy, is called Movile, after one of the boyar families of Moldova. But generally speaking, we can say that Constantinople was the locus of prestige. The boyars dressed like in Constantinople, adopted the customs there, and everything changed in, first in 1821, when the Greek War of Independence started, and when the Sultan lost faith in the Greek they were princes in the Romanian principalities, but they were more like civil servants in the Ottoman system. So there was this purge of the Greek aristocracy, and the voivode title passed to the local boyar families from 1821 onwards. And the big shift started in 1828, along with the Russian occupation of the principalities, because they brought with them French. The Russians had fought the French, had fought Napoleon in Borodino, and Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia. And subsequently, the Russians invaded Paris, occupied Paris. And because French culture was the hegemonic culture at the time in Europe, even though Napoleon had been defeated, the ideals of the French Revolution were still carried on. The French soldiers, the French officers, were speaking French. The Russian officers were speaking French. The Russian officers that occupied the Romanian principalities. So around 1828, the whole change started happening. The dress of the boyars shifted from the oriental one to the western one through this Russian occupation. Some modern institutions appeared, the first constitutions of the two principalities, the first parliaments, and the boyars obtained through the Treaty of Adrianople, which is Edirne today, the freedom to sell their produce, the agricultural produce of the two principalities, on international markets. They were no longer bound to sell them to Constantinople. So there was freedom of navigation on the Danube. This is also when the first pan-European institution was established, the Danube Commission. And because the boyars became interested in the West and Frenchified to some extent, and started to be more affluent, they sent their children to study in France, in Paris. And these children became introduced to the Masonic lodges, became agents of France, came back to the Romanian principalities and did the revolutions of 1848, the rather failed revolutions of 1848, but the liberal ones, and started to be patriotic in the sense that they wanted to build a national state. And because they were also vassals of France, they were agents of France. They would write these letters. Ioan Cebrețeanu, for example, the most important politician in Wallachia at the time, wrote to Napoleon III that Romania would function like a French colony. It would offer France all the benefits of a colony, but none of the costs. So it would need no army to pacify us because we would be willing. He spoke, of course, in the name of the elite, in the name of the boyars. So the boyars would be faithful French agents, and the country would be run in the interest of France, and so on. And Alexandru Ioan Cuza, who became the first prince after the unification of the two principalities, did actually cosplay after Napoleon III. Both his attire and his facial hair were mimicked after Napoleon III, the French emperor at the time. And these elites had France at heart first and foremost, spoke French among each other. Romanian was still under development, so it was still not regarded as a language of culture. And the next generation to go and study abroad was the one that came out rather differently. So they went to study in Berlin and in Vienna after 1871, after the fall of Paris to the German Empire, to Prussia, and then the German Empire was established. And Berlin became the center of prestige. Prussia, Germany became the intellectual center. And this new generation that went to study came back being conservative, rejecting liberal change, rejecting the agenda of the French Revolution that their predecessors had disseminated in the institutional framework of the Romanian state. They were romantic. They brought the national style in architecture. This is when the so-called Neo-Romanian style started, and they were in terms of liberalism, it's arguably that the generation behind them, their predecessors, were economically conservative. They saw great involvement for the state in the economy, and they were more liberal, more laissez-faire, more free traders. However, on social grounds, the first ones, the liberals, were socially liberal, and they wanted to give citizenship to everybody who was living in the Romanian lands, whereas the conservatives were, they were conservative in this respect, as opposed to being liberal in the economic sphere. And this is what made Romanian society, the elites, change allegiance from France to the Central Powers, which were already starting to develop as a political and military bloc, which eventually led to the First World War. Romania had this alliance after 1878, after it became independent as a consequence of the Russian-Turkish War. It developed an alliance with Germany and with Austria, also having the royal family of German origin and a part of the House of Hohenzollern, which was also ruling Prussia and subsequently the German Empire. And this secret military alliance did not enter into force at the beginning of the First World War, because there were still many fans of France, and a historian, Lucian Boia, in his book The Germanophiles, records these debates that were going on in Romanian society at the outbreak of the First World War, in the sense that the elite was divided not in terms of the gains that the country could make by joining either camp, but rather whose agents were they actually. So a part of the Romanian elite was an agent of France and wanted to join the war to help France, and another part of the elite was an agent of Germany, and they wanted to join the war to help Germany. In the end, the Entente side won, and Romania entered the war on the side of the Entente, quite unsuccessfully, but then we had a lot of luck. The Central Powers were defeated after they defeated us, and the Russian Empire also dismembered, so we could expand our territories. But from the end of the First World War onwards, the elite switched back to the Entente. The Liberal Party was very close to France, and the Peasants' Party, the other big party at the time, was close to England. And the German conservatives, German-leaning conservatives, dismembered, essentially. The land of the boyars was also distributed to the peasants who fought in the war, so their political role diminished. There was also universal suffrage, so there was no more conservative side. There was no more conservative party of the landed gentry. However, another force appeared in Romanian society to align itself with Germany, and that was it was a populist movement, in some sense by the sons of the let's say richer peasantry who could afford to send their children to study. And also towards the end of the 1930s, at the level of the political elite, as Germany was becoming more and more powerful, more and more political forces wanted to side with Germany, which in the end Romania did. And it went so far as to continue the war way beyond the point in which it was apparent that the war was lost. And the reason that Ion Antonescu, the leader of the country, gave at the time was that he gave his word to the Germans, and what would the Germans say? So he was more loyal to Germany than he was to his own people. The Soviets had already taken quite a significant part of Romania, and he still wanted to fight on because he had given his word to Hitler. So this was kind of the mentality, the continuation of this mentality to be an agent of a foreign power. Of course, Iuliu Maniu, the head of the Peasant Party, was later outed as being an MI6 agent under the name Tom, and subsequently some people from his entourage emigrated to Britain and stayed there during the Cold War and came back to Romania to enter politics on behalf of Britain. The same thing with some people that were in the elite of the Liberal Party. They went to France and they came back after 1990 also to represent the point of view of France. And during communism, of course, there was the illegalist element of the Communist Party that had emigrated to the Soviet Union before the war, and they were one part of the elite that was faithful to Moscow. There was another part that was created by sending students to study in the Soviet Union. And this generation was the one that made the revolution in 1989, the so-called revolution. Essentially, after 1958, after the Soviet troops were withdrawn from Romania, the regime in Romania started to be more national, started to have more sovereignty and to have a national orientation, to orient itself according to national interest. And this lasted until 1989, when eventually the regime fell through a putsch orchestrated by these very people who had studied in the Soviet Union, both in the military branch and in the political branch. They orchestrated the downfall of the regime, and they brought, in an unpredictable turn of events, the Soviet Union subsequently fell, so they were also without this foreign paymaster, so eventually they had to switch to the hegemon, which became the United States. But what I wanted to point out, and of course after 1990, there was this influx of scholarships, of grants from the Open Society Foundation of George Soros, from all sorts of American agencies, Freedom House, the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID. Here we come to the present. I've also worked in this system. I've also worked for some of these foundations. And now, to a large extent, the Romanian political class is tributary to this grant system by the Americans, to the Eisenhower fellowships, to all sorts of transatlantic bridges that are meant to create this elite that is faithful to US interests. However, the US is also in a crisis, crisis of legitimacy. The Romanian elites were very faithful to the Democratic Party, and they regard Trump as somebody who's not sophisticated enough to lead what they regard as the free world. So they are looking for alternatives. Some of them had their education in France and have been recruited probably by the French intelligence services. Others in Germany and are probably very well connected to the German deep state. And somehow, because this project, Project Ukraine, was advertised for so long, and Romania is becoming so connected, so interconnected institutionally with Ukraine, my expectation is that these elites will switch their allegiance slowly but surely to Ukraine, because Ukraine is also where a lot of funding can come from. There's a lot of money being laundered there, and of course, in all these billions that are allocated, Ukraine can also buy soft power wherever it needs. And there's also this ethos. There's this moralism which does not exist, for example, in Polish society. Poland also helps Ukraine. Poland also wants Russia defeated, but it has limits, and it would never sacrifice itself on the altar of Ukrainian interests. It would never appoint a prime minister that is a Ukrainian citizenship, that is a Ukrainian citizen, for example, and so on. So yeah, this is basically a brief history of the Romanian elites. If you like what I do, like, share, subscribe. If you want to support me financially, you'll find the link in the channel description how to do so. And until next time, take care.